Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. History 101, Episode 16, Egypt, the New Kingdom, War, Chariots, and Ozymandias. When we left off, the Hyksos were raiding and destroying Egypt. They had obliterated the Middle Kingdom. They had crossed the Sinai. They were stealing and destroying and taking, as Mesopotamian warrior pirates do. And the Egyptians couldn't stop them. The Egyptians didn't have an army. They had no history of war. Meanwhile, the Mesopotamians have horses. They have chariots. They grow up in a tough neighborhood. This is like Godzilla versus Bambi. So when the Mesopotamians show up, they're used to fighting Babylonians, Sumerians, Akkadians, Syrians, Hittites. They show up in Egypt and it's like, vacation. Now here's the thing. The Mesopotamians destroy the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom ends in blood and fire. It's not traumatic for the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom's dead. My death will not be traumatic for me. I'll be dead. The trauma is for the people who are left behind. So the trauma is Egypt, but not the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom's gone. The Middle Kingdom doesn't feel anything. It's gone. But Egypt and Egyptians are traumatized. And we go into the second intermediate period of what do we do? How do we prevent this from happening? Why did this happen? How do we get rid of the Hyksos? And what Egypt needs is a hero. Just like 1930s America needed Superman to fight fascism, Egypt needs a hero to defeat the Hyksos. So what does that hero need to be able to do? They have to be able to unify the nobility, build an army that can defeat the Hyksos, who are used to war, and motivate the people to stop future invasions. And they get that person in Ahmose. It is Ahmose who will unify the nobility. It is Ahmose who will build a new army. It is Ahmose who will motivate the people. It is also Ahmose who is referencing the Middle Kingdom. Here is a piece of art. So there's a little statue that is Ahmose's statue. And if you remember back to our Middle Kingdom, I had just a random statue profile of a Middle Kingdom pharaoh. And you could see Ahmose is making reference. He's carving himself to make reference to the Middle Kingdom. So in a lot of ways, he's seen himself as a restoration. That what the Hyksos are is an interruption, a not natural event. That instead, he's the continuation. Now he's not, because there are going to be so many differences, and that's why historians call it something else and not the Middle Kingdom or Middle Kingdom Part 2, because it's going to work differently. But at the time, Ahmose gains legitimacy by after unifying the nobility, by saying basically, I'm just like another pharaoh. I'm like the pharaohs you knew back in the day. I am your grandpa's pharaoh. So you do that by referencing imagery, by art. Now, it works. And what Ahmose is going to create is the New Kingdom. It's going to last 500 years, and it is the Imperial Age. This is the part where, like, people know two things about Egypt, and it's the pyramids of the Old Kingdom and the charioteers of the New Kingdom, Ramses, Thutmose. They know these two. And then we could get to the Greeks and Cleopatra, but they kind of don't know the Middle Kingdom. And so what a lot of people do is mix the two together. They say, oh, the New Kingdom had war. that war gave them money. They must have built pyramids then. And it's just not true. Ramses was 1,000 years from the last pyramids being built. But what the Imperial Age does do is create legitimacy through war and protection. Now, this is new. This is not Egyptian. Right? Conquering other people we have discussed 2,500 years of Egyptian history. Conquering other peoples is not what the Egyptians have done. So this is a completely new cultural connection. It's not naturally Egyptian. And that's going to matter later. What about that army that Ahmose and the others are going to have to create? Well, they create a Mesopotamian army. Why? Because they don't have time to invent a new army. They don't have time to invent an Egyptian army. How are Egyptians going to fight? Well, we don't know. We have to get rid of the Hyksos. And the Hyksos fight this way. And guess what? There's more Egyptians and we have more money. So what are we going to do? We're going to build the Hyksos army bigger. Chariots, horses, bows, bronze. We're going to just build an Egyptian Mesopotamian army bigger. Again, it's not Egyptian. This is totally new. The army does not represent the culture. It represents a foreign culture that Egypt is adapting. Kind of like cuneiform became hieroglyphics. So we've seen this process happen before. But Egypt has the money and it needs a solution, and so it buys itself a modern army. And now the art is changing. Take a look at this art. So where Ahmose is referencing the Middle Kingdom, that he's a continuation, King Tut here is completely different. King Tut is a warrior emperor. If you're watching the video, this is one of the most famous art pieces in all of the Middle Kingdom. I'm told it's King Tut. That's what the captions say. He's fighting the Nubians. So if you ever want to be like, well, the Egyptians were African, this is your evidence that they didn't see themselves as African, because they do paint themselves a different color. They do paint themselves differently. Now, race is a modern conception, or at least an early modern conception. So we don't have any racism here. Racism is modern. There's no racism in the ancient world. But it's the idea that they do see themselves as different. They are different people. But if you take a look at this art, you have King Tut standing 10 feet tall, right? 20 feet tall. He's huge. 2, he's got the ravens above him. That's the gods. So the gods are on his side. 3, he's got a massive bow. He's like Apollo of the Greeks. He's got a chariot with 2 horses. The giant horses, right? He does not have a driver. King Tut can drive and shoot at the same time. Why? Because he's Pharaoh. How many people is he killing? All of them. All of the enemy. All of the Africans that he's fighting. Plus, he's got animals on his sides. You've got your lions, your dogs. So he's commanding animals. Remember, he doesn't have a driver. Now, you need to have 2 people on a chariot. One has to drive the horses, one has to shoot the bow. Pharaoh can do it all by himself. He doesn't need anybody else. So who are the only other Egyptians in this scene? The servants fanning him, just in case Pharaoh gets a little sweaty from all his victories. Right? He's running over the enemy. He's shooting them full of arrows. And the only guys who are there to help him are his servants fanning him, making sure he doesn't get burned by the sun, making sure he doesn't schwitz too much. This is completely different. This is a warrior king god. This is completely different iconography of Egyptian gods. Notice how quickly we have changed from Ahmose to Ramses. This will also be the kind of iconography of Ramses. So you can see the new kingdom is not a continuation of the middle kingdom like Amos pretended it was. It is completely new. It sees itself as new. It acts differently. Why? Because it was traumatized and it will not be invaded again. It is going to make sure that the bad guys who invaded Egypt do not get to do this again. This is the United States invading Afghanistan and then Iraq and planning on invading other places after 9/11. Oh, there's terrorism someplace? We're going to go get them. That's why we've had drones in Somalia and troops on the ground in Yemen. All over the Southwest Asia and East Africa, the Muslim world. Because the Americans said, we don't want to get attacked again. That's why the FBI and the NSA are able to spy on mosques, on American citizens. That trauma, that reaction to trauma of not wanting this violence to happen again. So what are they going to do? Commit violence on others to make sure it doesn't happen again. So you may go, well, the Egyptians were okay traumatizing other people? Yes, yes, they were. Just like Americans are. Yes, they were. It is better to fight them over there than to fight them here. That is what every rich society has ever said. My Swedes in the 1640s, 1630s, the 1640s, the 1650s that I study, that I've written a book on, said the exact same words. When the Council of the King, when the Road met in December 1654, that was part of the argument. It is better to fight the Poles and the Russians in Poland than to wait for them to invade Sweden. The New Kingdom was just doing the same thing 3,000 years earlier. So you need to control the Nile and the Levant. Right? Libya is not populated enough to worry about. It's too big of a desert. So you need to control the Nile. That means Kush, Napata, Meroe, Meroe. These kingdoms down the, up the Nile in the cataracts. You're going to have to conquer parts of Africa. Now, what is that going to do? Now, we don't kind of talk about this, but that's going to bring African culture into Egypt. Without a doubt. Africans are going to be hired into the Egyptian army. Why? Because it's not really an Egyptian army. Remember, it's a Mesopotamian army that the Egyptians have created. So we've talked about back in the day how Africans were good soldiers, how Kushite soldiers, mercenaries were good. They're still good. So if you're an Egyptian king, you're going to hire a bunch of them because they're good. And so you prevent the invasion from down the river, from coming down the river, from Africa. But that also allows people then to move, cultures to move. If armies can get up the river quickly, that means trade can come down the river quickly. Why? Because armies need, as the Romans will tell us, armies need supplies, armies need food, armies need money. So where armies go, infrastructure has to follow. So you want to invade Africa? That's great. You have to build things that allow you to get food, money, supplies to your army. Otherwise it starves and it falls apart. So trade can come down, people can come down, workers can come down, mercenaries can come down. And so African culture enters Egypt. Now, there is an argument in a book called Black Athens, which makes the argument that Athenian culture is the basis of European culture. European culture is the basis of American culture. Yes, there's really no argument there. We make that argument in class. We have made that argument in history classes for 2,000 years. Yes. What Black Athens, the book, argues is a lot of that stuff was also African because of this time period. Because the Egyptians imported African technology, African food, African people, and they mixed. Now, is it a one-to-one mix? No, not even close. The Egyptians are much bigger people, much more people, but culture doesn't work one-to-one. It's flowing. People adopt things that make their lives better, that they like, that are cool. And so you get this mix, right? And then the Greeks, and Plato will tell you this, the Greeks import a lot of their culture, a lot of their advances from Egypt. Plato flat out says this. He says, all the good things we made better, but they came from Egypt. So Black Athens' argument is, more or less, in a simplistic way, is American culture is African. White culture is African. Why? Because Western civilization, having come partly from Egypt, is not Greek and Roman as much as Greek and Roman and Egyptian and African. As much as it is Judeo, Christian, and Mesopotamian. Ha! So, see, this is why racism is dumb. If you need an argument for why racism doesn't work, here it is. Because culture doesn't give a shit what color you are. And so, you have to control the Nile. And they do. Thutmose. King Tut. Thutmose III is the big conqueror. Right? King Tut is Tutankhamun. They will. But also you have to control where the Hyksos came from. And that's the Sinai, that's Cana, that's Phoenicia, and that's Syria, called the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. You're going to have to control these places. So you're going to have to send armies across a desert, across a second, more or less, desert, up the coast, into a more or less a third desert, until you reach the mountains where the Hittites are, which is 900 miles away. Right? Again, 900 miles is the length of Mesopotamia. So the Egyptians have to control one Mesopotamia in Egypt, a second Mesopotamia in Africa, and now a third Mesopotamia in the Levant. Who's going to do that? Well, you need strong warrior kings. Why? Because if you're lazy, you're not going to do that. Which is easier? Go fight the Hittites 900 miles away, where it's going to take you 6 months to get there, and 6 months to get back? Or to stay and eat strawberries with a bunch of sexy sex slave girls? Which one? Which would you rather do? Hang out in a hot tub or go live in a tent for a year? Most kings are going to pick the hot tub. And they'll send somebody else. They'll send some general. They'll send some noble homeboy who will want to go. Because it will help them make a name for themselves. And so, is that a good leader? Who's better, Pharaoh as a leader, or some dude, some homeboy who says, Pharaoh really likes me, you should listen to me, I'm in charge now, yay! Really? Yeah. No. And we're going to talk about that. But when you get strong warrior kings, and the New Kingdom will, they can do a lot. Amos will kick out the Hyksos. Thutmose III will invade Palestine and march up the river, conquering Cush. Ramses II, the biggest of them all, will fight the Battle of Kaddish versus the Hittites. Because the Hittites were moving into Syria, messing with some of Egypt's allies. And he said, Ramses, help us. And he said, okay, little lady, I will be there in 6 months. And they said, oh, okay, we're waiting for you. And what happened? He showed up with a 30,000 person army. Because when Ramses says, hey, I'm going to fight the Hittites, who's with me? Lots of people said, I am. The Battle of Kaddish is also the oldest battle we have of contemporary, where we have contemporary sources, of sources written at the time. In fact, we get both sides of the war. We have the Hittite version and the Egyptian version. And in both versions, Ramses is the man. Now, in the Egyptian version, he's like God King, super soldier who defeats the Hittites all by himself. It's a draw. The battle is a draw. But the Egyptians almost lost, and Ramses kind of comes in with a second attack and pushes back, and so it ends up in a draw, where both sides can claim victory. But in neither side do they say, oh, Ramses was a wimp who ran away. No, both of them are like, Ramses is freaking awesome. Now, the Hittite version will also say, our kings were better, we ambushed them, we got them, we were way smarter. Ramses fought hard. But was he smart? I don't know about that. But that's the Hittites, right? The Hittites are never going to say, oh, that guy is the super, super, super awesomest guy. But the fact that they go, hey, respect, says something about Ramses. And what Ramses really does is create Egypt as a great power. So does Thutmose, but it creates Egypt as a great power. It's somebody the Babylonians have to negotiate with. The Hittites have to negotiate with. If you're a little power, if you're a king in Cana of a tribe or a chieftain, you're like, what is Ramses going to do? What are the Egyptians going to do? Are they going to come out of the desert with their army to wreck my life? You have to ask. So Egypt went from being those dudes on the other side of the desert who you really didn't know much about. They go to being one of the three great powers in the world. Them, the Hittites in the far north, and Babylon, the largest city in the world. And so what do they do with this? To show off what's the legitimacy? This army creates giant monuments. They're going to build Mesopotamian iconography. They're going to use Mesopotamian iconography in order to show how awesome they are. And if you go to the British Museum today, there is a giant statue of Ramses II. It is enormous. I got it in the video. And it is impressive. Shelley will write Ozymandias, the poem. And if you're a Breaking Bad fan, you know the reference to this. In fact, there's a video of the actor from Breaking Bad reading this poem. And it's a reference. Ozymandias is Ramses II. The idea was they were bringing these giant Egyptian statues back to England, and they had a competition, a poetry competition, to celebrate these Egyptian statues showing up. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that sculptor well those passions red which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch away. So what is that poem about? That poem is about how all empires are great and then they disappear. Ancient Egypt, the Egypt of Ramses, was the richest country in the world, just like Shelley's Britain was. And it's all these things pass. I am King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. The idea that you can never achieve what I achieved. That's the idea of the poem. That's the idea of Ramses. That's the idea of Ozymandias. That's Hammurabi. That's all of these conqueror kings we're going to talk about. Look upon what I created. Isn't it awesome? You could never have done that. But time doesn't care. Time rolls on, and the sands ate what he created. And the lone and level sands stretch far away. All great things end. And so what are the problems of the new kingdom? First, it's expensive. There is nothing more expensive than an army, than a great army. We, in America, spend $700 billion on our army. It's 60% of the money of our discretionary spending, of the money we choose to spend, not the money we have to spend on like Social Security and Medicare. The money we choose to spend, 60% goes to the military. It's the one thing Democrats and Republicans agree on, to spend an immense amount of money on an army. There is nothing in humanity that costs more than an army. For example, we could educate every student in the country right now, send them all to community college. We could have free community college for everybody. It would cost 1/10 of what we spend in 1 year on the military. Free community college in America would cost about $60 billion. 1/10. So you have to find this money. You have to create this money. You have to have this money because you have to spend this money to have the horses, to have the grass, to have the food, to have the weapons. You have to have it. The second is what we talked about. You have to have active, powerful kings. You need A+ heroes. And they don't come along that often. We've kind of talked about this. How many Hall of Fame quarterbacks are there in the NFL right now? How many Hall of Fame, first ballot Hall of Fame, how many Steph Currys are there? Right? There's a handful. Right? LeBron's once a generation. The kind of player LeBron is. Right? They don't come along. That doesn't mean that they all suck, but many will suck. And most are just average, okay, perfectly fine guys trying to do their best. Journeymen, yeomen. But the new kingdom required having a Hall of Fame pharaoh all the time. Because without it, what happens? African kings start to go, hey, I'm 900 miles away. Why am I listening to this pharaoh who just hangs out in a bathtub, in a hot tub? Same thing with the Hittites. Hittites go, hey, that king isn't so powerful. Let's gobble up some of his allies. Like, you had to be on your toes all the time as a pharaoh of the new kingdom. You couldn't relax the way you could in the old kingdom or the middle kingdom, knowing that your position was very stable. You were playing with house money. Because number 3, it put Egypt out into the world for the first time. It made it a target of other states. Hey, if I'm a Hittite king and I have to worry about what the Egyptians are going to do, I know I have to build my army to fight the Egyptians. And when I'm strong, like the Hittites did at Kaddish, why not provoke a fight? See if they'll come. Okay, Ramses came and fought us to a draw. I didn't lose anything. And Ramses is the best king that they have. So what about Ramses the 16th? The drunkard. How tough is he going to be? So I can gobble stuff up, and hey, if they don't come, I win. And if they do come and I beat them, I still win. And if they do come like Ramses and I get a draw, or even lose a little bit, I still keep most of what I took. So now Egypt is a target. You're going to have to fight Egypt. And notice what happens in our Mesopotamian chapter. The Assyrians will invade them. The Persians will invade them. Right? Countries start to invade them. They figure out a way to attack Egypt. 3b is the Egyptians don't like it. Notice I kept saying, this is not Egyptian. The Egyptians would rather just stay in Egypt. Making pyramids is way more Egyptian than getting into an army and invading the Levant. They don't like it. And this is very American. The Egyptians don't like, they think Egypt is the greatest country in the whole wide world. And let's be honest, in 1500 BCE, it is. So why would you want to leave? There is even an idea that if you died outside of Egypt, you couldn't get into the afterlife. So that's an incentive to not go, which also tells you how awesome Ramses is, how awesome Thutmose is. Because he could go to the guys, hey, you're getting into the afterlife. I'm making sure of it, no matter what. And they go, okay, we're with you. We're with you, Ramses. If you're going to risk it, I'm willing to risk it. And if you're promising me I'm getting into the afterlife, no matter what happens, I'm with you. But Egyptians don't like invading Syria. Like, they don't create colonies. They don't create, as I talked about the cultural mixes, the Egyptians don't flood into Africa and make the third, the fourth, the fifth cataracts Egyptian. They remain African. Cana remains Cana. The Phoenicians remain the Phoenicians. They're not absorbed. The Egyptians just want to have allies. They show up and they're like, are you going to fight us or and invade us, or are you going to be our friends? And if you're a Phoenician, you say, we'll be your friend. And the Egyptians say, great. If anyone invades you and they're coming for us, let us know. This is why when we talk about the Hebrews are Mesopotamian people culturally. They look like Mesopotamians. Their Semitic language is a Mesopotamian language group, right? But their political alliance is with the Egyptians. The Egyptians are their big cousin who's going to bail them out of any fights with Babylon. And we're going to talk about that. So it's a weird situation, but if you know you're in Cana, Israel, Judah, the territories that have these names at the time, you know Egypt is close, and Egypt is powerful, and Babylon's far away. So politically, and the Egyptians don't want to own us. They just want us to tell them if someone bad is on the way. Cool, I can work with that. Whereas the Assyrians are going to want to own everything and crush people. So what happens to the New Kingdom? The New Kingdom dies in the Bronze Age collapse. Like Babylon, like the Hittites. You do get a series of weak kings. After Ramses, the second, the third, I mean, there's a couple of good ones. They're not first ballot Hall of Famers, but they're not terrible. You know, Ramses III is good, is a perfectly good king. But you do get a bunch of bad ones too. And what they get is invaded by the sea. The Bronze Age collapse brings Proto-Greeks, Mycenaeans, they're called the Sea Peoples. But what we know is they came by sea and they carried axes, which means they're barbarians, right? Because an axe is also a tool for timber. It's the same weapon that, Germanic or Scandinavian barbarians will have. It's kind of the simplest Other than the bow, it's kind of the simplest of weapons for barbarians to have. So when you see they showed up with axes, one, it's a terrible weapon. It's not, I don't mean terrible as in like a bad weapon to use. It requires a lot of space and whatnot to use it, but it's like it creates terrible wounds. It's not. Ugh. These guys also are going to have iron weapons. And they come by sea, which is not where anyone expected them to come from. Egypt has never been invaded by sea before. So why would you prepare for it? You're waiting for an invasion from Africa or from the Levant. They got invaded by the sea. And that led to a collapse, which again, isn't their fault. Everybody collapsed. It's like being upset that your house got flooded in a tsunami. So on your test, don't be like, oh, that new kingdom, they just sucked. No, because everybody got subsumed in this. Now, New Kingdom Egypt will die in the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt will continue to exist, but it's the end of independent Egypt. The 25th dynasty will be a Kush dynasty. It's an African dynasty. It's African kings who will come down the river, just like Ramses and Thutmose and Ahmose were worried about. They'll come down the river, incorporate Egypt into their empire. So now you got even more mixing than what we had before. Now we have imperial mixing because we got black African pharaohs who are accepted as pharaohs, by the way. Unlike the guys who will come later, the Assyrians and the Persians, the Kushite pharaohs are pharaohs. They're accepted as pharaohs. They will be kicked out of Egypt by the Assyrians. There's a brief 26th dynasty after the Assyrians are destroyed. That is independent, quote unquote independent, and they'll be absorbed by the Persians. And then the Persians will be destroyed by the Greeks, and that's the Ptolemaic Macedonians, who the last one of them is the Cleopatra of the big nose. So Cleopatra was awesome in a lot of ways. She wasn't conventionally attractive. That's one of those things. We put her in the movies and it's like Elizabeth Taylor. It's the hottest women we can have, right? That's not who she was. Her sexiness, and she was incredibly sexy, was based on being a pharaoh. But she was also Greek. She was Macedonian. She wasn't African. She wasn't purely Egyptian. And kind of like with Hitler, there's been a lot of like trying to find out what her race really was. But you have to understand, her culture was Greek. Her culture was Macedonian. That's how she thought of herself. That said, Egyptian culture meant there was a lot of mixing of Greek, Macedonian, which are two different things, Persian, Egyptian, and African, all mixing together. Cleopatra will commit suicide when her war ally, Mark Antony, loses. See, this is what happens. We've started this class with what happens when you depend on a man. He loses, and she has to commit suicide. We might talk about Cleopatra later because it's a good story. We'll have a side story. So then the Romans controlled Egypt, and the Romans will be pushed out by the Arabs, and that will create essentially the building blocks for modern Egypt. Modern Egypt today is a Arab country worshiping an Arab Middle Eastern god. An Arab, Jewish, Christian, Middle Eastern god. Not an Egyptian one. So it's a foreign people worshiping a foreign god. Because it's been that culture. It becomes part of the Middle East. It becomes part of the Arab world. From 630 something until today. And so that's what happens to new kingdoms. It dies in blood and fire. Just like Babylon does, just like the Hittites do. And what recovers is a shadow and is owned by other people. It becomes the wealthiest place on earth and becomes a prize for more powerful empires to own. and Egypt really isn't independent again, because it will then be taken over by the Turks in the 1500s. It's not fully independent again until really, 1950 or so? A modern Egypt breaks out of the British Empire somewhere around 1950 or so. And remember, a lot of its art is now in Paris, in London. And modern Egypt is trying to get it back, saying, hey, that Ramses statue is ours. And this is where modern racism comes in. This is where modern culturalisms come in, and all kinds of because the response really from Europe is, yeah, we know it's yours, but we are not sure you can handle it. It's safer here. Right? It's patronizing. I mean, there are other arguments too, but they all boil down to, we don't really think you can handle the responsibility of a giant Ramses statue or a giant Babylonian griffin. Or, I mean, look what happened when the Americans conquered Iraq in 2003. Looting happened all over the place, and they destroyed a lot of Iraqi and Mesopotamian cultural artifacts. See, if that stuff had all been in Europe, it would have been fine. Of course, they leave out all the stuff that was destroyed by the First and the Second World War, right? The Americans obliterated, lots of art with their bombing. So that's that gets into a whole nother thing. But the New Kingdom is the most famous, probably because it's the war one. And military history has been, for the most part, political history, has been history for a long time. And so while the pyramids are great in the Old Kingdom, and the culture is cool in the Middle Kingdom, there's a affinity in European culture for the New Kingdom. It's King Tut, it's Ramses, it's the Bible, right? Moses takes place after Ramses II. Like the Pharaoh in Exodus is a New Kingdom Pharaoh name, Ramses. It's not Old Kingdom. It's not Middle Kingdom. It's not even Amos. Notice Amos, Tutmos, these guys were related, right? They're similar families, right? Ramses is a different family. And so Exodus is calling him Ramses. It's a New Kingdom name. So it gives you, when the Exodus writers were writing in 500 BC, 1,000 years later, their memory of Egypt is not Old Kingdom Egypt. It's not Middle Kingdom Egypt. Their memory of Egypt is the Ramses Egypt. So the way Homer is writing about the Mycenaeans going to sea to attack the Trojans, he's not talking about phalanxes. He's not talking about tightly grouped citizen armies. When Homer writes about the Trojan War, he's writing about Mycenaean sea captains, sea pirates. So he's remembering an older time. So that's where we'll leave off. That's the end of the New Kingdom. That's the end of Egypt. Though Egypt and Mesopotamia will pop up in different places, in our next episode, we start the Hebrews. Thank you. Be safe.